considered Glasnost and Perestroika from the point of view of the traditional Catholic teaching on communism and socialism as enunciated by Popes Pius IX, Pope Pius XI, and Pope Leo XIII. We concluded that on the political level, Glasnost and Perestroika were another attempt of the familiar communist ploy of presenting liberalization to the West in an attempt to gain increased economic support and to break down Western resistance or Western commitment to defense. However, we considered it too from the deeper theological perspective, and we felt that Glasnost and Perestroika were an integral part of a move, a centuries-old move to establish a world based on purely natural order, purely natural foundations, a world order from which the law of our Lord Jesus Christ would be totally excluded. George Bush, Mikhail Gorbachev, and John Paul II have often referred to this new empire as the New Age or the New World Order. Indeed, we do believe it is a new empire that we are seeing now in its incipient form, but it is the empire of the Antichrist. I'm Julius Smetona. This is what Catholics believe. Perhaps no recent event has done as much to cast doubts upon the sincerity of Mikhail Gorbachev and his liberalization as the situation in Lithuania. After Lithuania declared independence on March 11th, it increasingly has come under more and more severe Soviet pressure. Today we have a very special guest with us. He is the grandson and namesake of the last president of independent Lithuania. Recently he spent 2 weeks touring Lithuania in a concert tour and orchestral and recital appearances, and 5 days after he left came the Declaration of Independence. He had left Lithuania in 1940. He was born in 1939 in Paris. His family fled, beating the communists out of the country by perhaps a half an hour. He never set foot in the country again until just recently. He is a graduate of the Juilliard School of Music and has distinguished himself in several international piano competitions. Also with us today are the Reverend Fathers William Jenkins and Father Clarence Kelly, two priests who say the traditional Mass, Latin Mass exclusively, and who reject the Second Vatican Council and the new religion which it generated. Anthony Smetona, Father Clarence Kelly, Father William Jenkins, welcome to What Catholics Believe.
Thank you.
Anthony, you recently spent some time in Lithuania, and what are your impressions of Glasnost and Perestroika in view of these recent events, the Soviets cutting off fuel and even food, and President Bush's posture? What do you feel about Glasnost now?
Well, I feel that it's a sham from beginning to end. And the people, of course, in Lithuania, who are people in a position to know these things, they never doubted this is a sham from the word go. And I think it's interesting to note that when I met with Algirdas Brazauskas, who at that time was the chairman of the Supreme Soviet of Lithuania, he recounted a meeting that he had with Mikhail Gorbachev, wherein Gorbachev said, if you secede, we'll have to invoke martial law. And Brazauskas asked him, he said, on what grounds? We were doing everything according to your guidelines. He said, we'll find grounds. And then Brazauskas asked him, what about Bush? And Gorbachev said, Bush and I are like this.
That's very interesting that you said that, because in today's morning newspaper, President Bush defended his policies in saying, look, he's pursuing America's best interest. He's a president of Americans, not of Lithuanians. And
are interested in the best interests of the Soviet Union and Gorbachev. And I think really that this is the problem, that we're always concerned on how a certain policy will affect Gorbachev, whether his interests will be safeguarded. I think it's time to stop helping Gorbachev and to start helping Lithuania. We don't need Gorbachev. Gorbachev needs us.
I'd like to ask Mr. Stasana a question, if you don't mind. Why do you think Bush is more interested in the interests of, or in the welfare of Gorbachev than he is in an independent Lithuania?
Well, I think that there have been some secret agreements made that are going to lead gradually towards a one world order. First of all, we'll have, if Gorbachev's plans are unimpeded, which certainly they're not so far, we'll have a loose confederation of Europe, a united Europe, of course under Gorbachev's control, and then we'll have a slightly tighter confederation. Then the same thing, of course, is in great danger of happening here in our hemisphere. And finally, we'll have a new world order and 5,000 years of dark ages.
I think there is an incredible foolishness on the part of the gullible American people. As much as I love America and I love the American people, we have to admit that they're extremely gullible, and they program their thinking according to the diet that is fed them by the television, by the radio, and by the newspapers. We have to remember that Gorbachev belongs to an international gang of the most ruthless and brutal murderers that have ever walked the face of this earth. There is no essential difference between Adolf Hitler and Gorbachev. The difference would be that Gorbachev is worse than Hitler. Gorbachev rose to power on mountains of bodies and rivers of blood. The communists are murderers and liars. They have always been murderers and liars. And when you see a ruthless and brutal gang of murderers and liars putting themselves forward as liberals trying to bring about peace, you have to be mindless to believe them. You absolutely have to be mindless to believe them. And what has happened in Lithuania, and is happening even today in Lithuania, should prove to the American people that if they don't wake up, they are going to end under this communist boot. They have to recognize the fact that George Bush, when he says that he is interested in preserving Mikhail Gorbachev, he is telling them the truth, that that is what he is doing. He is interested in keeping him in power, as if Gorbachev were somehow a knight in shining armor. We have to remember that the Communist Party and this international group of gangsters, they are the ones who put Gorbachev in power, and they gave him instructions to follow.
It's good to remember that Gorbachev himself came to power via the KGB. He was the head of the KGB. And it's interesting that Gorbachev's a Leninist. And Lenin is the one who said to his ears the sounds of victims screaming, who are rather being tortured by the communists. This scream is more pleasing to his ears than the Beethoven Symphony.
Well, the head of the CIA fairly recently said that there has never been as much KGB activity in the United States and in Europe as there is today. Mm-hmm. So how could anyone, realizing the truth that these agents of the communists are more active now, how could they see that and understand that, and at the same time believe that this wrestling match that's taking place, this phony orchestrated show that's put on the international scene, how could they possibly believe that it's true?
Father Jenkins.
A recent ABC News poll claims that 61% of the American people support Bush's policy toward Lithuania, which means basically they support Bush allowing Lithuania to be re-enslaved by the Soviet Union. Is that true? Heaven only knows. You don't know what to believe, what you see on the media anymore, because they all have their own interests to pursue. They all have their own programs and policies they're trying to get across to the people. It could very well be true because of the sinfulness of the people, because of their laziness and dissipation. They might find that an easy way out. They might like the idea of appeasing Gorbachev by casting to him measures of appeasement, victim nations, sure, and not interfering with him. In fact, Lithuania and the people who are leading its independence movement are portrayed often as the unreasonable troublemakers who are provoking our good friend Gorbachev. and are not letting him pursue a nice, peaceful transition policy. It could be that the American people are gullible, but I think that gullibility is as a function of their own dissipation very often. They seem to lack a certain moral principle. They don't seem to be able to be outraged anymore at true injustice. They're fed a steady diet of concern about seals and whales and snail darters. But as far as the true human dignity, which is the value of the soul, and the necessity of saving one's soul, it just totally is beyond them. They don't hear it anymore from their priests. They don't hear it anymore from their bishops. The bishops put out pastoral letters talking about economic justice and so on. But they don't talk about souls. And this is the real evil of the communist system, that it is designed to condemn souls to hell.
Anthony, you wrote an article for the Roman Catholic, and you had a very moving account of a visit with a relative of yours, and he related what happened to him when the KGB took his father away.
Yes, that really was hard not to break down. This is a whole branch of our father's side of the family that I didn't even know existed. And the reason that they had more or less fallen into obscurity is because anyone who carried the name was persecuted relentlessly during the post-war years. And he told me this story that when he was 8, the KGB came and they took his father away, and his father and he exchanged a glance. Both knew in that instant that they would never see each other again. And he just picked up his son in his hands, kissed him, and then he left forever. And those people to this very day, I mean, their life in Lithuania is not as easy as those who made some kind of accommodation. But also, they had kind of an integrity that shone forth, that you knew you'd be perfectly safe in any circumstances to trust them with your life. And I'm sorry to say that other people from the other side of the family, or perhaps from no side of the family, I would feel very uncomfortable if my life depended on them.
It's amazing, and these are the people that President Bush prefers, these gangsters. He would prefer to be friends with them than the people of integrity. You're watching this, Kelly and Jenkins and Anthony Smetona. You know, we're touching a little about the political developments. I think perhaps even more disturbing is the big picture. Now, Anthony, you had a very interesting experience at the Kaunas Theological Seminary during your visit, and you also had some interesting things to say about the KGB role in training of priests in communist countries.
Well, when I was researching my article, I felt that perhaps I had overstated the case as far as my criticism of religious life in Lithuania today is concerned. And I delved into the matter a little more deeply. And much to my chagrin, I found that during the post-war era in Lithuania, any candidate to Lithuanian Catholic Theological Seminary had to be approved by the KGB. So that means, of course, that no one who wasn't loyal to the system would be approved. And also, the KGB went out of their way to approve people that were coarse, unrefined, and of limited intelligence, thus hoping also to cause a certain deterioration in the priesthood. And then it follows that none of these people really had a true vocation. At least most of them could not have had a true vocation.
In this day and age, we look upon Christendom as something, if anyone even considers it at all, as a fairy tale. But you know, just 45, 50 years ago, like for instance in Lithuania, Poland, even Ireland, at noon, people would get down on their knees in the streets and say the Angelus. People would greet each other, all praise to Jesus and Mary, and they would say forever and amen. And of course, this is no longer the case. Are there any remnants of this? Did you see this in the seminaries?
Well, I was very anxious to visit the seminary because I know, of course, about the drastic drop in enrollment in American seminaries, and I was curious to see what was happening in Lithuanian seminary. And the first thing that happened is I greeted the porter with this traditional "Praise be to Jesus Christ," and he hesitated. And when he gave the traditional response, he was kind of embarrassed about it. And I thought, well, why should he be embarrassed? This is a seminary; we're all priests. And then, right before lunch, grace was said kind of surreptitiously, silently. The sign of the cross was made kind of, so as not to really give it away, that anyone would be able to recognize it as such. And then after lunch, when we went to look around the church, the conversations continued. I mean, in somewhat subdued tones, of course, but that somehow this kind of free talking is totally in contradiction with what Catholics believe about respect and veneration for the Most Blessed Sacrament. So at that time, of course, I hadn't heard about the KGB requirement for being accepted in the seminary, so I thought this was strange. This is a Catholic country. These are all priests. What are they afraid of? But later, of course, it became clear to me.
You know, Father Jenkins made a point earlier that one of the worst evils of a communist system is that it forces almost people to be bad. In other words, to lie, to cheat, and steal, and in this way, to lose their souls ultimately. And even if it was materially a successful system, that would make it horrible in the eyes of God. What have you found? Did you find anything like that there? What did you find to be the moral effect of communism on a country that used to be so Catholic?
Well, I found, for example, that there is a whole generation that was raised almost without any religion at all. But still, I mean, if they were given the chance, I feel that they would bounce back immediately, that they really have a thirst for this, and that they really shook off the years of indoctrination of communist ideology immediately. But I find definitely that if there are any vestiges of the true Catholic faith left in Lithuania, they're very well hidden. They're very well hidden, and I was reminiscing about how what I'd heard from people before, and I was in a church sort of thinking out loud perhaps, and it was very, very strange. A woman in her 60s came up to me and she said, "You came too late," and just disappeared. You know, implying that there was some resistance, but you know, it's rapidly being stamped out.
Fathers, talking about the big picture, recently there was an article where John Paul II now is calling a synod of European bishops to discuss the new Europe which is going to emerge. Now, as by way of background, I find it very, very inconsistent that these new bishops and John Paul II, who are the champions of justice and liberty for all kinds of causes, were strangely silent on what's happening right now in Lithuania.
Well, I think to put it in the big picture, excuse me, you have to recognize the fact that for at least the last 200 years, there have been certain forces in the world that have been trying to establish what they called the Universal Republic, which would be a one-world government, and corresponding to this one-world government would be a one-world naturalistic religion. And they have been working for this for many, many years, and clearly those who are in control of the political centers of the world, and also today now, at least of the external institutions of the churches and of what used to be the Roman Catholic Church, they are moving in that direction, the direction of a one-world government and a one-world church. And, for example, the unification of Europe, the economic unification of Europe in 1992 certainly indicates the coming of a government, a single government for all of Europe, and the external, the superficial lessening of control behind the Iron Curtain, the unification of Germany, and so forth. I think all of these indicate that the world is moving in the direction of establishing this one world government, and it's absolutely foolish for us not to recognize the fact that these world leaders who are supposed to be concerned with freedom and liberty only seem to get very upset, except in minor instances, but generally speaking, they only get very upset when the so-called government that they're trying to correct in terms of human rights abuses, they only get really upset when that government is really anti-communist, thoroughly anti-communist. You can see it, for example, in Africa. You can see that there are many dictators that have been installed in countries, but as long as those dictators are pro-communist or socialist, there's no problem. But as soon as there is someone in power in a government who is anti-communist, then it's a totally different story. And I think in the big picture, that's what we have to keep our eye on. The unification of Europe, the ultimate unification of, say, Europe and the Soviet Union, and perhaps the unification then of those countries and the United States, the establishment of this so-called Universal Republic, and the establishment of a one-world religion. And quite obviously, I think what they are doing is setting the stage for the Antichrist and for the kingdom of Satan in this world.
Father Jenkins, could you expand on that? How do we see in this establishment where President Bush and Mr. Gorbachev and John Paul II are always concerned with these human values which have nothing to do with grace, nothing to do with the passion and death of our Lord, but are, you know, something like poverty, distribution of the wealth. They're all concerned. How does this tie in to this new republic?
Well, for several centuries now, the one world republic has been the great project of the secret societies, the Masonic societies throughout the world. And President Bush, as a student at Yale University, was a member of the Skull and Bone Society, which is one of the oldest secret societies in this country, with revolutionary aims. John Paul II himself is a kind of protege of and a kind of a creature, a theological creation of Paul VI. Paul VI is the author of Populorum Progressio, which is a great social encyclical in which he talks about human this and human that, making a more human world. He talks about the human conditions of the world. But there's absolutely no concern in the writings of this Pope in his encyclicals for souls, the salvation of souls, or anything supernatural. Purely naturalistic. And he's actually setting the social stage for the one world religion, which is going to be a religion of the earth. Like we just celebrated Earth Day, which is probably going to be one of its great feast days in the future. It's, they're using the concerns of the people and manipulating their anxieties to try to make each one of them kind of an evolutionary revolutionary who's going to fall right in step with their ideas of an earth religion, which does not recognize souls, salvation, Jesus Christ, a supernatural God, or anything of the kind.
You know, in history, there have been several great upsets. For instance, David versus Goliath, where if you read in Scripture, it said Goliath was 10 cubits tall, which is roughly 10 feet tall. I mean, he was huge. There, of course, is the great examples of how God helped the Israelites, for instance, in the book of Judith, where Judith cut off the head of the Assyrian Holofernes and they put it up on the walls of the city, as very similar to the situation in Lithuania. Holofernes surrounded the city and was going to starve and the people to death, and the people were saying, you know, maybe we should go in, give in, and they were starting to question God and to grumble, and she went out and she said, how can you do this? Our confidence is in God. What would you recommend for the situation of a country such as Lithuania, where now the United States and the West have dropped any pretense of being anti-communist and clearly said, we're not going to help you? What should they do?
They've got to return to the true morality. They've got to return to the basic teachings of the Ten Commandments, the moral law. They've got to put away abortions. They've got to put away divorces. They've got to put away all of this immoral stuff for which God will condemn them. After all, communism is nothing but a disease. It's a moral disease. That's all it is. And it preys upon what is weak morally. And just as God did save in a rather spectacular fashion the people of the Old Testament, either because they themselves did penance or because some great figure stood up and begged God for his mercy. So we need that today. We need that for not only Lithuania, but for our own country as well. People have got to put away this immorality. And it's the only way they're going to be able to overcome this spiritual disease of communism.
You know, even in 1964 in Brazil, they were on the verge of a communist takeover. And the women just went into the streets en masse and said the rosary, and in an almost miraculous way, they just left. The communists simply left. Father Kelly.
In the case of the Syrians that you mentioned, Holofernes, he could not understand why the Israelites resisted him. He had the most powerful army on the face of the earth. And this little tiny nation had the gall, that's the way he looked at it, to resist this great army. And he asked people, why are they resisting us this way? And one of his advisors said to him, they are resisting you because of what they believe. He says, however, I will tell you whether you will be victorious or not over them. Send spies in among them to see if they are obeying the laws of their God. And if they are obeying the laws of their God, you will not be able to overcome them. But if they are disobeying the laws of their God, you will be victorious over them. And I think that's the story. But it's not only that. It's not just the things which Father Jenkins mentioned, but the fullness of it. For example, the traditional Mass. The new Mass must be rejected because the new Mass is both sacrilegious and destructive of the Catholic faith. It is not the renewal of the holy sacrifice of Calvary. And if we do not have access to the blood of Christ on Calvary by means of the Mass, we are finished. The world cannot survive without the holy sacrifice of the Mass.
Reverend Fathers, we're out of time. Anthony